1950s movies versus television. So the 1950s turns out to be a pretty tumultuous time for the film industry. The 1940s, despite being in a major world war, was actually a really good time for the film industry. That film industry was at its peak during that time period. Well, 1950s ushers in a major time of change, which we saw when we reviewed and learned about blacklisting and the Red Scare. It had a major impact on celebrities, but there's also some other things that are going on that will impact movies. The first thing is television. So television was in fact invented just before the American involvement in World War II. However, due to the war, manufacturing of commercial television was delayed because factories focused their attention on wartime production instead of commercial production. So now that the war is over, we're going to have this mass influx of televisions going into people's homes. So when World War II ends, electronic companies, they begin mass producing TVs. Motion picture industry had hoped that it was going to be just kind of a passing phase, but by the middle of the decade, more than half the homes in America had televisions. And we all know how this story is going to end. Television is going to take on a life of its own. The movie industry has to change the way that it ends up making its movies in order to accommodate these changes in society. So the first thing that they do is they recognize that fewer adults and children are going to the movies because it's much easier for them to stay at home to be entertained. So anybody that's ever had small children knows that going to the movies can be really challenging. So it's much easier to stay at home. So they recognize that, but they also recognize that teenagers continue to go to the movies because they like to get out of their house and do things with their friends. And more importantly, their parents don't mind giving them some money to send them out of the house to go do some things with their friends. So what the motion picture industry does is they begin producing films that appeal to the teen demographic instead of all demographics. So that's a huge impact that the influx of television has on film. It actually changes what types of movies are going to be made. In addition to that, family life changes after World War II. So after World War II, many soldiers come home from the war and they want to start a family. This leads to the expansion of the suburbs. Movie theaters were traditionally built in the cities, and they found that they were losing money because suburban families weren't going to pack their family up into the car and travel into the city to see a movie. If they were, it was going to be a special occasion. So they started seeing that their numbers started going down. So what happened was movie companies began building theaters in suburban neighborhoods and essentially go to their audience instead of making their audience come to them. Now, 1960s is going to take on a whole life of its own, but we're going to pause there because that's its own lecture.